Close your eyes and picture the Sahara, endless dunes, cracked earth, heat shimmering off sand that stretches to every horizon. Now erase that picture completely, because for thousands of years it was wrong, dead wrong. Right now, in the middle of what we call the world's greatest desert, there are places where hippos once wallowed in deep freshwater lakes, where crocodiles slid through rivers that no longer exist, where herders walked their cattle across grasslands so lush, so green, that if you dropped a modern person there without warning, they'd swear they were somewhere in East Africa, not the Sahara. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a brief wet spell either. It lasted for thousands of years, long enough for entire cultures to rise, adapt, and build their whole way of life around a landscape that would eventually vanish beneath the sand. Around 3900 BC, something shifted. Scientists often point to this date as a marker, a moment when the drying process crossed some invisible threshold and accelerated. But here's what's important to understand right from the start. Nothing about this happened in a single day or even a single generation. This wasn't a switch flipping from green to brown. It was more like a long, uneven goodbye. Some regions dried out faster. Others held on to their lakes and rivers for centuries longer. Rain patterns faltered, recovered, faltered again. If you had lived through it, you might not have even noticed the change year to year. You'd only feel it looking back, the way you might realize a friendship faded only after it was already gone. So why does any of this matter thousands of years later? Because when a landscape this massive changes, it doesn't just affect the people living directly on top of it. It sends ripples outward in every direction, rivers that start in one place, end somewhere else entirely. People who lose their grazing land don't just disappear, they move. And when they move, they carry ideas, animals, tools, and sometimes entire belief systems with them. A drying Sahara didn't just create a desert. It may have helped push people toward the Nile Valley, toward the very beginnings of what would become one of history's most famous civilizations. It may have shaped migrations into the Sahel, into the Mediterranean world, even into the Levant. That's really the central question running through everything we're about to explore tonight. How does a slow climate shift in one place end up shaping societies hundreds, even thousands of miles away? How do rivers, rainfall, and wandering herds connect to pyramids, to early kingdoms, to the very idea of settled civilization? These connections are easy to miss if you're only looking at one place at a time. But if you step back, if you let your mind drift across the whole picture, you start to see threads linking climate to migration, migration to farming, farming to hierarchy, hierarchy to the first true states. It's history, but it's also something closer to ecology, geography, and human adaptation, all woven together. Before we go further into that story, I'd love to know a little about you, the person actually listening to this right now. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is there as you drift off. I always find it fascinating imagining all these different time zones, all these different corners of the planet, everyone settling in for the night while we travel back thousands of years together. And if you enjoy unwinding with these long, slow journeys through history, the best way to support this channel is by following the show on Spotify. That's where full episodes live, ready whenever you need something calm to fall asleep to. If you enjoy what you hear, leaving a 5-star review helps more than you'd think. The link is right there in the description whenever you're ready. Now, let's step back into that vanished green world, back before the sand, back when the Sahara still remembered what it meant to be alive. Scientists have a name for this vanished world. They call it the African Humid Period, and if you've never heard the term before, that's understandable. It doesn't show up in most history books. It lives instead in the quieter corners of climate science, in journals about lake sediments and pollen cores, in research that rarely makes headlines, but that quietly rewrites everything we thought we knew about one of the most iconic landscapes on Earth. The time frame itself stretches back much further than most people would guess. Depending on which researcher you ask and depending on which specific region of Africa they're studying, the African Humid Period is generally placed somewhere between roughly 14,500 years ago and that gradual ending we've already mentioned, somewhere around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, or in calendar terms, somewhere in the range of 3,900 BC and the centuries surrounding it. That's not a brief blip. That's not some seasonal anomaly. That's close to 10,000 years, an almost unimaginable stretch of time during which the driest place on the planet today was, in many ways, nothing like a desert at all. But here's where we need to slow down and be careful, because it's tempting to imagine this entire period as one continuous uniform paradise. Green from coast to coast, lush from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Picture postcards of jungle where there's now only sand. That image is seductive, but it's also wrong, or at least it's incomplete. The reality, according to the evidence we have, was something far more interesting than a simple Green Sahara. It was a mosaic. Think about what that word actually means. A mosaic isn't one uniform colour. It's countless small pieces, different shapes, different shades, fitted together to form something larger. That's a much better way to picture the Sahara during this period than any single image of unbroken jungle or endless meadow. In some regions, especially near the higher elevations and along the edges closer to the Mediterranean and the Nile, you would have found genuinely dense vegetation, gallery forests lining rivers, thick grasslands capable of supporting large herds of grazing animals. But travel a few hundred miles in another direction, and the landscape might shift into something drier, more open patches of scrubland interrupted by seasonal water sources that came and went with the rains. This matters because it changes how we should imagine the people and animals living there. They weren't living in some endless tropical paradise where food and water were guaranteed everywhere you looked. They were navigating a patchwork, a landscape that rewarded knowledge, that rewarded knowing exactly where the reliable water was, exactly when the seasonal rivers would rise, exactly which lakes held fish year-round and which ones might shrink to mudflats by the end of the dry season. It was abundant, yes, far more abundant than anything we'd associate with the Sahara today, but it was not effortless. Nature rarely is, so what exactly filled this mosaic? Let's start with the grasslands, because they may have been the most transformative feature of all. Across huge stretches of what is now barren desert, seasonal grasslands spread out, where today there's nothing but rock and sand. These weren't necessarily the deep, permanent grasslands you'd find in East Africa's famous savannas, but rather grasslands tied closely to the rhythm of the rains, flourishing green during wet seasons, drying to gold or brown during leaner months, then returning again the following year. This kind of environment could support enormous herds of grazing animals. Giraffes, antelope, buffalo, elephants, fossil and rock art evidence places all of them firmly within the ancient Sahara, animals we now associate almost exclusively with savannas far to the south. Then there were the wetlands, shallow, seasonal, sometimes vast, providing breeding grounds for fish and waterfowl, resting points for herds, moving across the landscape, gathering places where early human communities could reliably find food and water even during the driest months of the year. Some of these wetlands connected to larger river systems, and this is where the picture becomes even more remarkable. Rivers that no longer exist in any visible form once cut channels across the Sahara, carrying water from wetter highland regions out into the heart of what is now empty desert. Satellite imaging and radar technology, tools our ancestors obviously never had access to, have revealed traces of these ancient river channels buried beneath the sand, some of them running for hundreds of miles, evidence of a hydrological system almost unrecognizable compared to the Sahara we know today. And then, perhaps most striking of all, there were the lakes. Not small ponds, not seasonal puddles, but genuinely large bodies of water, some of them among the biggest lakes that have ever existed on this planet. Lake Megachad, for instance, once covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea, the largest lake in the world today. At its peak, it may have stretched across more than 390,000 square kilometers. Around bodies of water like this, entire ecosystems flourished. Hippos, crocodiles, and countless species of fish thrived in waters that today have shrunk into a small, struggling remnant, or in some cases vanished from the map entirely. Now, how do we know any of this? This is where the story becomes almost detective-like, piecing together clues from wildly different fields of study, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Start with the rock art, because it might be the most immediately powerful evidence available. Scattered across mountain ranges deep within the Sahara, places like the Tassili Niger in Algeria, or the Gilf Kebir in Egypt, ancient peoples left behind thousands of paintings and engravings on stone surfaces. And what do these images show? Not camels, not sand dunes stretching to the horizon. Instead, we see herds of cattle, hunting scenes involving animals like giraffes and hippos, swimming figures, fishing scenes, entire compositions depicting a world of abundant water and abundant life. These aren't decorative fantasies. They are, in a very real sense, historical documents, painted by people who were recording the world they actually saw around them. Then there's the pollen evidence, preserved deep within lake sediments and soil layers, offering scientists a kind of ancient botanical record. By analysing which plant species were releasing pollen into the air at different points in time, researchers can reconstruct what kind of vegetation covered specific regions thousands of years ago, whether it was desert scrub, savanna grassland, or something closer to tropical woodland. Lake sediment cores tell a similar story from a different angle. Layer after layer of material settling to the bottom of ancient lake beds over thousands of years, each layer holding chemical and biological signatures of the surrounding environment at the time it was deposited. Rising and falling water levels, changing mineral content, shifts in the types of organisms present. All of it combines to create a timeline of environmental change, stretching back tens of thousands of years. And finally, there's the archaeology itself. Tools, settlement sites, animal remains, all scattered throughout regions that are completely uninhabitable today without modern technology. Their mere presence tells us something significant. People couldn't have lived there without water, without food, without an environment capable of sustaining human life for extended periods. So when we use a phrase like the Sahara died, it's worth remembering that this is useful shorthand, not a precise scientific description. The Sahara didn't experience a single dramatic death. It didn't collapse all at once into the desert we recognize today. What we're really describing is the slow, uneven unraveling of an entire interconnected system. Grasslands, wetlands, rivers and lakes, all gradually failing at different rates in different places across many centuries. It's a phrase that helps us grasp the scale of the transformation, even if the true story, as we're about to explore, was messier, slower, and in many ways even more remarkable than a single dramatic ending. To understand what this meant in human terms, you have to stop thinking of the Green Sahara as a place with a few scattered oases. An oasis is an exception, a tiny interruption in an otherwise hostile world. This was different. During the wetter phases of the African Humid Period, water was part of the structure of the landscape. It shaped where animals moved, where plants grew, where people camped, traded, married, buried their dead, and decided to return year after year. And the largest example of all was Lake Megachad. Modern Lake Chad is still large enough to matter. It supports millions of people in the borderlands of Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon. But compared with its ancient predecessor, it is almost hard to recognize. Today, it is a shallow, shifting lake, its size changing dramatically with rainfall and water use. During the early and middle Holocene, however, the broader Lake Chad basin held a body of water so extensive that scientists call it Mega Chad. At its greatest known extent, roughly several thousand years before the final drying of the Sahara, Mega Chad may have covered more than 350,000 square kilometers. Some estimates place it even higher. That would have made it larger than many modern countries. Imagine standing on a shoreline in what is now northern Chad or northeastern Niger and looking out over water so wide that the far bank was beyond the horizon. Not a pond, not a seasonal marsh, an inland sea. This lake did not remain the same size forever. Like every water system in the Green Sahara, it expanded and contracted with changing rainfall. Its edges were often broad wetlands, channels, islands, reed beds, and shallow bays, rather than one neat, permanent shoreline. But that actually made it more biologically productive. Shallow water, sunlight, aquatic plants, fish nurseries, nesting birds, grazing grounds along the margins. It would have been an ecosystem capable of supporting an astonishing amount of life. Fish thrived there. So did crocodiles and hippos. Water birds arrived in great numbers, some staying year-round, others following seasonal migration routes between Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Along the shore, elephants could drink, buffalo could graze, antelope could move through the grasslands. Predators followed the herds, and humans followed all of them, though not always in the same way. The lake also had an outlet during some wetter periods. Water could flow northeast through channels now buried or nearly invisible beneath sand, eventually reaching the wider drainage systems of the Sahara. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes the map completely. The central Sahara was not always a dead end. Under the right climatic conditions, it was part of a connected hydrological world. Mega Chad was the giant, but it was not alone. Across what is now Libya, Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, Niger, and Mauritania, researchers have identified the traces of many ancient lakes. Some are known from sediment cores, others from fossil shorelines, shells, fish bones, old river deposits, or satellite images showing pale channels beneath the sand. A paleolake is simply an ancient lake, a lake that existed in the past but has since shrunk or vanished. And the Sahara had more of them than the modern map would ever suggest. In the Fezzan region of southwestern Libya, ancient lakes formed in basins surrounded today by severe desert. In Sudan, the now dry Wadi Hawa once carried seasonal water westward toward the Nile. In Egypt's western desert, basins such as Nabta Playa held water seasonally, drawing animals and people back again and again. Farther west, in Mauritania, the old lake basin of the Aouka preserved evidence of a wetter world where water pooled and vegetation reached far beyond its modern limits. None of these places needed to be permanent lakes, the size of Mega Chad to matter. A lake that lasted only part of the year could still transform a region. If it filled reliably after the rains, if fish remained in its deeper pools, if grass grew around its edge, then it became a node in a larger network, a place where animals gathered, a place where people could meet, a place where knowledge mattered, because life in the Green Sahara still moved to a calendar written by rain. The wet season brought grass. It filled channels and low basins. It turned dry ground into temporary pasture. Herds spread out, taking advantage of fresh grazing over wide areas. But then the rains ended. The grasses began to yellow. Smaller pools evaporated. Seasonal rivers broke apart into disconnected stretches of water, and animals, including humans, had to make decisions. Where was the next dependable source of water? Which basin would still hold fish after the shallow ponds disappeared? Which route had enough grazing to support cattle, sheep, goats, or wild game along the way? This was not a world where people simply wandered without direction. It was a world that rewarded memory, not just individual memory either, but memory stored in communities. The location of a spring, the timing of a flood, the route around a dry escarpment, the place where reeds could be cut for mats, where stone could be found for tools, where fish were easiest to catch as water levels fell. A child growing up in this landscape would have learned that the Sahara had seasons, not the 4 seasons familiar to temperate climates, but a deeper rhythm of wet and dry, abundance and narrowing choices. The rains opened the land. The dry months concentrated life around the water that remained. And this is why seasonal rivers mattered so much. Today, when we hear the word river, we tend to imagine something permanent, like the Nile, the Mississippi, or the Amazon. But many of the Saharan waterways were seasonal. They flowed strongly during rainy months, then weakened, fragmented, or vanished from the surface during the dry season. In Arabic, a dry valley that may carry water after rain is called a wadi. Across the Sahara, many wadis preserve the skeletons of former river systems. Some were modest streams, others were major drainage networks, carrying runoff from highlands and wetter zones deep into the interior. The Tamarasset River system, for example, once ran through what is now Algeria and Mauritania, perhaps connecting interior highlands toward the Atlantic during wetter intervals. Radar images have revealed its buried channel under vast dunes. It is one of those discoveries that makes the present-day desert feel strangely temporary. Beneath the sand lies the outline of a river valley. The Wadi Hawar, farther east, was sometimes called the Yellow Nile because it formed a major corridor between the central Sahara and the Nile Valley. During wetter periods, it likely carried enough water, or at least supported enough vegetation and seasonal pools to make movement across this region far more practical than it would be today. That word corridor is important. We often picture the Sahara as a wall between North Africa and the rest of the continent. And today, for the most part, it is. Crossing it requires planning, vehicles, fuel, wells, maps, and a serious respect for the possibility of dying very quickly. But during the African Humid Period, the region was less like a wall and more like a complicated web of passages. Not easy passages, not paved roads through a pleasant countryside, but routes shaped by water, pasture, and seasonal knowledge. Lakes connected to wetlands, wetlands connected to river valleys connected to uplands, grasslands, and eventually to the Nile, the Mediterranean coast, the Atlantic margins, the Sahel, and sub-Saharan Africa. Animals used these corridors first, or at least continuously. Giraffes ranged much farther north than they do now. Elephants moved through regions where only desert foxes survive today. Buffalo, hartebeest, antelope, and perhaps wild cattle found grazing in landscapes that have since become barren. Hippos and crocodiles lived in waters far north of their modern ranges. Their presence is confirmed not only by rock art, but by bones, fossils, and the ecological logic of the environments reconstructed from sediments. There is something almost surreal about it. Hippos in the Sahara, crocodiles in basins now surrounded by sand, giraffes moving beneath rock shelters in the mountains of Algeria. But this is not fantasy. It is what the evidence points toward. And where large animals go, humans have reasons to follow. For hunter-gatherers, the benefits are obvious. Water means fish, shellfish, waterfowl, edible plants, and game drawn to drink. Grassland means grazing animals. Wetlands offer reeds, fibers, and perhaps predictable food sources during difficult times. A lake shore can provide stone, clay, wood from nearby vegetation, and a place to encounter other groups. For pastoralists, people keeping herds of cattle and later other domesticated animals, the rhythm of water and grass was even more central. Cattle needed reliable drinking places. They needed pasture. Their herders needed to know when to move before the land became exhausted or dry. The seasonal opening and closing of the landscape may have encouraged a pattern of movement that was neither fully nomadic nor fully settled. People could return to favoured places year after year, establishing camps, cemeteries, ritual sites and exchange networks, while still moving with their animals when the season demanded it. So the Green Sahara was not simply abundant, it was organised abundance. Water created predictable gathering points. Seasonal change created movement. Movement created contact. And contact created opportunities for people to exchange stone tools, ornaments, livestock, stories, marriage partners and ideas. This is the foundation we need to keep in mind before we talk about the people themselves. They did not enter an empty wilderness and somehow make it livable through sheer determination. They inherited a landscape already rich with possibilities, a landscape of lakes, grasslands, fish, herds, and river corridors. Their skill was in learning its rhythms well enough to live within them. For thousands of years they did. But who were these people? The honest answer is that they were not one people. Not one tribe, not one language, not one shared identity stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Nile Valley. The Green Sahara covered an area almost the size of the United States. Over thousands of years, it was occupied by many communities, living in different environments, speaking languages we cannot recover, making choices shaped by local water, animals, seasons, and connections with their neighbours. Archaeology gives us fragments, a hearth blackened by ancient fire, fish bones in the sand, grinding stones, pottery broken and scattered across a former shoreline, a burial, cattle bones, paintings on rock walls hidden in dry mountain shelters. From these fragments, a broad picture begins to emerge. Around the lakes and wetlands, many Saharan communities were hunter-fishers. That phrase can sound simple, but it describes a highly skilled way of life. Fishing in a large lake or seasonal marsh is not just a matter of standing in water and hoping for the best. People needed to understand where fish gathered when water levels fell, how channels changed after the rains, where reeds created shelter for young fish, and which species could be caught at different times of year. At sites in the central Sahara, archaeologists have found bones of large fish, including catfish and Nile perch-like species, sometimes astonishingly large ones. There are harpoons made from bone hooks and other tools that suggest people were harvesting aquatic resources systematically. In some wetlands, fish may have been one of the most dependable foods available. When grazing animals moved away with the changing season, a shrinking lake or marsh could concentrate fish into smaller areas. What looked like loss of water could briefly become an opportunity. There were also turtles, shellfish, waterbirds, crocodiles, edible plants, wild grains, and game arriving to drink. A lakeshore was not a single food source. It was a crowded pantry. And this may help explain why some people return to the same places again and again, not necessarily building permanent towns in the modern sense, but establishing familiar seasonal camps. A place might be used during the rainy season, abandoned when pasture or water shifted, then revisited the following year. Over generations, people left layers of ash, stone tools, pottery, animal bone, and burial grounds. The camp became part of a mental map, a location remembered through stories and kinship. This is important because mobility does not mean aimlessness. A mobile community can know a landscape in extraordinary detail. In fact, it often has to. People moving between pasture, water, hunting grounds, and stone sources may carry a map in memory far more precise than anything drawn on paper. They know which valley holds water longest, which lake margin becomes dangerous after heavy rain, which ridge offers shelter from wind, which grasses return first after the wet season, which families are likely to be camped at a particular spring. And then cattle entered the story. Exactly when cattle first became fully established across different parts of the Sahara is still debated. The evidence is complicated. In some regions, cattle appear early enough that researchers have long argued over whether local wild cattle may have been managed or domesticated in Africa independently, or whether domesticated cattle ultimately arrived from the Near East and then spread widely through African networks. The details remain unsettled, but the larger pattern is clear. By the Middle Holocene, cattle pastoralism had become deeply important across much of the Green Sahara. This changed how people related to the landscape. Hunters follow animals that belong to no one. Herders care for animals that do. A herd is food, certainly. Meat, milk, hides, bone, dung for fuel, perhaps blood in some later pastoral traditions. But a herd is also wealth, security, memory, and social connection. Cattle can be given in marriage arrangements. They can be exchanged. They can be inherited. They can be lost in drought, disease, theft, or conflict. They tie people to pasture and water, but they also make movement necessary. You cannot keep cattle in one place forever if the grass is seasonal. So many Saharan pastoralists probably lived by a rhythm of planned movement. During wetter months, herds could spread across open grasslands, feeding on fresh growth. As the dry season advanced, people may have moved toward more dependable water. Lakes, deep pools, springs, river margins, or upland zones where moisture lasted longer. Some families may have travelled with animals while others remained at fishing grounds or gathering places. Some communities may have combined herding with hunting, fishing, and collecting wild plants rather than choosing only one way of life. That flexibility matters. The old categories can mislead us. Hunter-gatherer, fisher, pastoralist, farmer, real communities often lived between these labels. A household keeping cattle might still rely heavily on fish. A group known for hunting might acquire milk, hides, or animals through exchange. People did not wake up one morning and abandon every older skill because cattle had appeared. They added new possibilities to an already sophisticated knowledge of the land, and cattle themselves became symbols. You can see this in Saharan rock art. Across the Tassili Niger in Algeria, the Ekakus Mountains in Libya, the Tibesti, the Ndadi, and other rocky regions, artists painted and engraved animals, people, scenes of herding, and figures whose meanings are now difficult to recover. Some images are thousands of years old. They show giraffes, elephants, hippos, antelope, wild cattle, and later domesticated cattle. In some paintings, people appear leading animals, standing beside them, perhaps milking them, perhaps performing rituals whose purpose has vanished with the people who made them. It is tempting to treat these images like photographs from the past, to look at a painted herd and say, "There, this is exactly what daily life was like." But rock art is not a photograph. It is a choice. Artists chose what was worth showing. They may have painted animals that were rare, powerful, sacred, dangerous, or socially important. They may have recorded ceremonies rather than ordinary work. A wall covered in cattle tells us cattle mattered. It does not automatically tell us who owned them, how often people moved, whether everyone had equal access to them, or what language was spoken around the fire after dark. Still, the art is moving because it gives us something archaeology rarely provides, a glimpse of attention. Someone looked at the curve of a horn, the stride of a giraffe, the broad body of a hippo, the shape of a human figure walking beside an animal, and decided it mattered enough to preserve. Some of these paintings were made in places that may have served as stopping points along seasonal routes. Rock shelters offered shade, protection, and durable surfaces. They may also have been places where groups met, exchanged goods, arranged marriages, marked shared identities, or performed ceremonies. We cannot know every purpose, but it is hard to imagine that all this art was made in isolation. The Green Sahara was full of connections. Stone from a particular source can turn up far from where it was collected. Shell ornaments travelled across regions. Pottery styles sometimes appear over wide areas, though similar pottery does not necessarily mean people belong to one culture. Ideas can move without populations moving. Objects can move through many hands. A bead found hundreds of miles from the coast may have passed from one group to another over years, perhaps generations. What seems likely is that mobile communities maintained social networks across long distances. Networks of kinship, exchange, information, and obligation. In a changing environment, these networks could be life-saving. If one lake failed, relatives or allies elsewhere might know of pasture near another basin. If a herd was lost, exchange partners might help a family recover. If rainfall patterns shifted, news could travel along the routes people already used. And this is where the Green Sahara begins to feel less like an empty expanse and more like a living world. Not densely urban, not filled with cities and written records, but inhabited, remembered, negotiated. A world of seasonal camps beside water herds moving through tall grass, fish drying near reed beds, children learning routes their grandparents had travelled, strangers becoming trading partners, and distant communities linked by things as practical as stone and cattle, and perhaps as human as stories. For thousands of years, the rains made this possible. But rain is not a promise, and slowly, unevenly, the conditions that supported this wide, mobile world began to change. The first answer lies far above the Sahara, in the slow mechanics of the solar system. Earth does not travel around the Sun in exactly the same way forever. Its orbit changes shape slightly, its axis tilts by small amounts, and, most importantly for this story, the direction of that tilted axis slowly turns, like a spinning top wobbling through an almost unimaginably long cycle. These changes are subtle. No one living through a single generation would look at the sky and notice them. But over thousands of years they alter when Earth is closest to the Sun, and how much summer sunlight reaches different parts of the planet. During the African Humid Period, northern summer received stronger sunlight than it does today, not because the Sun itself had changed, but because Earth's orbital arrangement gave the northern hemisphere a more intense summer season. Around 11,000 years ago, summer in the north occurred relatively close to the point in Earth's orbit when the planet was nearest the Sun. That extra sunlight heated North Africa more strongly. And that matters because monsoons are, at their heart, giant systems of moving air responding to differences in heat. Land warms faster than ocean. When the Sahara and the regions south of it baked under an intensified summer sun, the hot land heated the air above it. Warm air rises. As it rose, it created a broad zone of lower pressure over the continent. Moist air from the Atlantic Ocean and from the Gulf of Guinea was drawn inland to replace it. As that moist air moved northward, it rose, cooled, and released rain. This was the West African monsoon, but stronger and farther north than the version familiar today. The seasonal rain belt, often called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, did not stop near the Sahel. In the humid period, it could push deep into what is now desert. Summer storms fed grasslands, lakes, streams, and wetlands across huge areas of North Africa. The Green Sahara was not created by a single permanent rain cloud sitting over the desert. It was created by a seasonal system arriving year after year, far enough north often enough to keep the landscape alive. Then Earth's slow orbital rhythm continued. Over several thousand years, the timing of Northern Hemisphere summer gradually shifted away from Earth's closest approach to the Sun. Summer sunlight over North Africa weakened, again, not dramatically from one year to the next. The change was almost absurdly slow. A lifetime might contain only the faintest hint of it. But climate systems do not always respond in a smooth, gentle line. As the summer sun became less intense, the land heated less strongly. The contrast between hot continent and cooler ocean weakened. The monsoon had less force behind it. Moist air still came inland, but on average it did not travel quite as far north. Or it arrived for a shorter season. Or its rains failed more often. At first this may have meant only a small shift. A lake that once refilled reliably after the rains had a few disappointing years. A seasonal river ran for less time. Grass returned later. Pasture dried earlier. People and animals could adapt to this. They had always adapted to variation. A dry year was not the end of a world. But a pattern of dry decades is something else. And here is where the Sahara becomes more complicated than a simple story of less sunlight producing less rain. Vegetation helped make the rains possible. When grasses, shrubs and trees covered the land, they darkened the surface. Dark ground absorbs more sunlight than pale sand. Plants also released water vapor into the air through a process called transpiration. Their roots helped hold soil in place. Their leaves reduced the amount of dust lifted by wind. Moist soils stored water from one season to the next. All of this reinforced the monsoon. A greener Sahara absorbed more heat, added moisture to the atmosphere, and created conditions that could encourage further rainfall. Rain grew vegetation. Vegetation helped sustain rain. It was a feedback loop, one of those quiet systems that can make a climate more stable than it first appears. But feedbacks work in both directions. When rainfall weakened, plants began to thin. Bare ground reflected more sunlight back into space. Drier soil held less moisture, with fewer plants. Less water vapor returned to the air. Vines picked up more dust from exposed surfaces. Dust matters more than it might seem. Fine mineral dust can scatter sunlight, reducing the amount of solar energy reaching the surface. It can also alter clouds and affect how heat moves through the atmosphere. A dustier Sahara could become less able to heat the air strongly enough to pull the monsoon northward, which meant less rain, which meant still less vegetation, which meant more dust. The system had started to lean in the other direction. Think of a campfire dying down. For a long time the fire may look steady. Then one log shifts, the flames weaken, less heat reaches the next piece of wood. Ash begins to cover the coals. Nothing dramatic happens in a single second. But after a while the whole fire is different. That is one useful way to imagine the end of the Green Sahara. The orbital changes with a long, slow shift in the background. But the local landscape, the soil, plants, lakes, dust and atmosphere, determined how that slow change was experienced on the ground. This is why researchers still debate exactly how fast the transition happened. The broad picture is not much in doubt. Northern Africa became drier through the Middle and Late Holocene. The monsoon retreated southward. Many lakes shrank or disappeared. Grasslands gave way to more open scrub, then desert in many places. Communities adjusted, moved, reorganized, or found themselves living in landscapes their grandparents might barely have recognized. But the timing was not identical everywhere. A lake basin in one region may show a long decline over centuries or millennia. Another may appear to have changed rapidly. Pollen preserved in lake sediments can suggest vegetation shifts. Dust layers from marine cores can reveal when more Saharan material was blowing into the Atlantic. Cave deposits, ancient shorelines, river sediments, and archaeological sites each offer part of the picture. But each record has limits. A lake core may preserve changes only at intervals. A shoreline can tell us water was once higher, but not exactly how people experienced every dry season in between. Radiocarbon dates come with ranges, not perfect calendar precision. And a climate shift that looks gradual when averaged across 500 years could still contain sudden failures of rain that were devastating to the people living through them. So was the Sahara's drying abrupt or gradual? The most careful answer is both, depending on where you stood and what span of time you measured. From the perspective of Earth's orbit, the change was gradual. It unfolded over millennia, driven by cycles so slow that no single person could see their beginning or end. From the perspective of a family waiting beside a shrinking waterhole, it may have felt brutally sudden. One generation could inherit familiar routes and reliable pasture. The next could find that the seasonal pond failed twice, then 3 times. A route known for centuries might no longer support cattle. Fish camps could become dry sand. Social networks built around moving through a green interior would have to stretch, bend, or break. And somewhere within that long goodbye, one date would become especially useful to archaeologists and historians. Around 3900 BC, the change was impossible to ignore. But what does that really mean, impossible to ignore? It does not mean that on one morning in 3900 BC, every lake in the Sahara vanished, every grassland turned to sand, and every family packed up and walked toward the Nile. History almost never gives us a date that clean. Climate certainly does not. 3900 BC is better understood as a marker inside a much longer transformation, a point on the map, not the whole journey. By then, in many parts of North Africa, the old humid world was no longer reliably functioning as it had for thousands of years. The rains had been weakening for a long time. Lakes had been fluctuating. Some seasonal rivers had become less dependable. Grasslands were breaking into patches. The monsoon was retreating south, not in a neat straight line, but in fits and starts. A few wet years could still bring relief. A sequence of dry years could undo it. And different parts of the Sahara experienced that change differently. This matters because the Sahara is enormous. It stretches from the Atlantic coast almost to the Red Sea, across mountains, basins, ancient river systems, rocky plateaus, and vast lowlands. Even during the African Humid Period, it was never one uniform green paradise. Rainfall varied, elevation mattered. Some places held lakes. Others supported seasonal pasture. Some had permanent springs or wetlands. Others depended on a short annual season of water. So when the climate changed, it did not change everywhere on the same timetable. In some basins, the evidence suggests surprisingly sharp shifts in lake levels. A lake can be a sensitive thing. If rainfall falls below a certain level, while evaporation remains fierce, the balance can change quickly. Water that had covered broad, shallow margins may pull back within decades. Reeds dry out, fish habitats shrink, shoreline camps are suddenly far from the water they once overlooked. To the people living there, this would not have felt like a gentle trend measured across centuries. It would have felt immediate. The old landing place no longer reached the lake. A familiar fishing ground became mud, then dust. Animals concentrated around fewer water sources. Rival groups arrived at the same places, seeking the same shrinking supply. But vegetation often tells a slower story. Grasslands do not disappear in a single uniform wave. First, perhaps, the rainy season becomes shorter. Then grasses return less densely after the rains. Shrubs survive where open pasture fails. Hardy plants remain in sheltered places along drainage lines near groundwater or in the shadow of hills. Trees linger long after the conditions that allowed new trees to establish have become rare. A landscape can look alive while becoming less secure. This is one of the strange difficulties of environmental history. The final stage of a system can resemble its earlier stage, at least from a distance. There may still be green after rain, there may still be cattle grazing. There may still be water in a basin, but the margin for error is gone. A community can endure one poor season. It may endure several. It can move animals, trade for grain, visit relatives, draw on stored food, or shift its camp to a better-known water source. These are not helpless people waiting for nature to decide their fate. Saharan communities had deep knowledge of the land. They understood seasonal movement, animal behavior, wild plants, and the location of water that outsiders might never find. But adaptation has limits when the entire regional pattern is changing. A route only works if the next pasture still exists. Herding only works if dry season water remains available. Fishing settlements only work if the lake returns. Exchange networks only work if neighbouring communities have something to spare. By around 3900 BC, many of those calculations were becoming harder. That is why this date appears so often in accounts of the Sahara's transformation. It falls within the late phase of aridification, when archaeological evidence from many areas points toward retreat, reorganization or abandonment of places that had supported people during wetter millennia. It is not the date the Sahara died. That phrase is dramatic, and it captures a real loss. But it can also mislead. The Sahara did not die all at once, nor was it empty afterward. People continued to live in deserts. They lived around oases in mountain regions, along great rivers, beside surviving lakes, and across the southern margins where seasonal rain still arrived. They adjusted old lifeways and created new ones. Some areas remained usable longer than others. Some communities may have moved gradually, returning seasonally to familiar places before finally giving them up. Others may have stayed put until one crisis made staying impossible. And even the date itself is not as exact as it sounds. When archaeologists say around 3900 BC, they are combining several kinds of evidence, each with its own clock. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of carbon in once living material. Charcoal from a hearth, a bone, a seed, a fragment of wood. But radiocarbon dates are estimates, calibrated through complex comparisons, and they usually come with ranges. A camp may date to a span of decades or centuries rather than a single year. Lake sediments tell another kind of time. Layers of mud, pollen, shells, salts and wind-blown dust can reveal whether a lake was deeper, shallower, fresher or more saline. But a layer may represent a few years, many decades, or longer. Wind and water can disturb it. Gaps can form. A lake may preserve a sudden drought beautifully while missing the slower recovery that followed. Pollen can suggest which plants were growing nearby. Yet pollen travels. Some plants produce far more of it than others. A record showing fewer grass pollen grains may reflect a genuine regional decline or a more local change in vegetation around the sampling site. Then there are archaeological sites. If camps, cemeteries, tools, pottery, and animal bones become rarer in a region after a certain time, that may indicate abandonment. But it may also mean people changed how they moved, used less visible camps, or settled in places that have not yet been found. Absence in archaeology is evidence, but it is rarely proof by itself. So the careful version of the story is quieter and more interesting. Around 3900 BC, the Sahara had crossed important thresholds in many regions. Water systems that had sustained communities became less reliable. The monsoon no longer reached as far north as it once had. Some lakes contracted sharply. Vegetation thinned more slowly, unevenly, leaving islands of life amid expanding dry country. Human populations responded in different ways, according to their local landscapes, their animals, their alliances, and the options available to them. For some, the long goodbye may have begun generations earlier. For others, it may have arrived later, but by this period, the balance had changed. The green interior of North Africa was no longer a broad, dependable world connecting communities across the desert. It was becoming a place of separated refuges, difficult crossings, and memories of wetter routes. And when a landscape that once connected people begins to divide them, movement becomes more than a choice. It becomes history. The first response was not necessarily to leave. It was to move differently. For thousands of years, people in the Green Sahara had organized their lives around seasonal rhythms. When rain came, herders could range widely across grasslands with their cattle, goats, or sheep. Hunting parties could follow animals into open country. Fishing communities could return to lake shores and wetlands. Families could meet at familiar places during the best part of the year, exchange goods, arrange marriages, share news, and then separate again when the dry season approached. The landscape did not need to be wet everywhere, all the time. It only needed to offer enough water, pasture, and predictability for people to move between one useful place and another. As those conditions changed, the old rhythm began to break. A seasonal journey that once ended at a reliable pool might now end at cracked mud. A grazing area that supported cattle after the rains might produce only thin grass. A lake shore used by generations of fishers might retreat so far that the old camp stood miles from open water. The people who knew these places best would have noticed the change long before anyone could describe it as climate. They would have known it in practical terms. The animals were taking longer to fatten. The water tasted different. The rains arrived late, or ended early. The old route had become risky, and when a route becomes risky, you do not always abandon it immediately. You test it, you adjust, you travel with fewer animals, you leave earlier, you send a small group ahead to check a water source. You keep returning because perhaps this year will be better. Perhaps the rains will come back, perhaps the grass beyond the next ridge is still there. This is why migration out of the Sahara was probably not one great march in one direction. It was more likely a long series of decisions, repeated by different communities over generations. Some families may have shifted their dry season camps closer to permanent springs. Others may have spent more of the year near lakes that still held water. Some herding groups may have moved toward highlands, where elevation could bring slightly cooler temperatures, more reliable runoff, and protected valleys. Mountain massifs such as the Tibesti, the Ahaga, and other upland regions did not become easy places to live, but they could preserve springs, vegetation, and animal habitat after the surrounding plains had grown harsher. These were refuges, not paradise, not untouched green islands, but places where survival remained possible. Oases mattered too. An oasis can seem almost miraculous in a desert. Groundwater rises near the surface. Palms and reeds grow where nothing around them suggests water should exist. Birds gather, animals find shade, people can stop, rest, and perhaps remain. But oases are not unlimited wells. Their water depends on geology, rainfall far away, and the slow movement of water underground. A growing number of people and animals could strain them quickly, so even the places that offered relief could become crowded. Imagine arriving at a spring your grandparents had known as a quiet stopping point. There are already other families there. Their animals are drinking. Their storage baskets are beside the water. They may be relatives. They may be trading partners. They may be strangers. Everyone understands the same problem, and that understanding can produce cooperation. It can also produce tension. Water brings people together. Scarcity decides how long they can remain together. To the east, the Nile Valley offered a different kind of refuge. It was not simply a river waiting to receive the people of the Sahara. It had its own communities, landscapes, flood patterns and limits. But as the interior dried, the Nile became increasingly important because it was a long green corridor running through otherwise difficult country. Its annual flood renewed strips of fertile ground. Its marshes and river channels supported fish, birds, reeds and grazing. Its banks connected settlements by boat and by foot. For people accustomed to moving across wide seasonal landscapes, the Nile may have seemed both generous and constraining. There was dependable water, but there was also less room. Life became concentrated along a narrow ribbon of land. Southward, the retreat did not always mean entering complete desert. It could mean following the rains as they shifted toward the Sahel, the broad belt south of the Sahara where seasonal rainfall still supported grass, shrubs, livestock and farming in suitable places. Communities could move toward the margins of the old desert world, toward regions where wet and dry seasons remained severe but workable. Further south and west, lake basins and river systems became especially important. Around Lake Chad, in the Niger inland delta, and in other wetlands, water created productive environments even as the northern interior became less dependable. These places could support fishing, hunting, herding, and eventually increasingly settled forms of life. But it would be a mistake to picture every Saharan community moving in the same direction. A fisher living beside a shrinking lake had different choices from a cattle herder crossing seasonal pasture. A group with ties to Nile communities had different options from one whose kin lived near the Sahel. Some people may have moved only a short distance from an exposed plain to a sheltered valley. Some may have changed their economy, relying more on hunting or gathering when livestock became harder to maintain. Others may have kept herding, but with smaller animals better suited to dry conditions. And some people stayed. They stayed because they knew hidden water sources, because their ancestors were buried there, because leaving a homeland is never just a practical calculation, because the next place was already occupied, because there had been dry periods before and people had survived them. Adaptation and displacement were not opposites. They happened together. A community might adapt for decades, changing its seasonal movements, narrowing its territory, altering its diet, building stronger ties with neighbours. Then one sequence of failed rains might finally push part of that community elsewhere. Those who left could remain connected to those who stayed. They could return in better years. They could carry pottery styles, livestock practices, stories, and marriage ties across great distances. This is how a changing climate reshapes a human world, not only by emptying places, but by making connection harder. The old Saharan routes had depended on chains of usable places. A waterhole here, a pasture there, a known campsite beyond the hills. A trading partner near the lake. Remove enough links from that chain, and the distance between surviving communities becomes much greater than it looks on a map. The desert was not simply expanding over empty land. It was breaking apart an older network, and the people moving toward the Nile were not arriving from some separate world. They were carrying the interior with them, its skills, its animals, its memories, and its long experience of living where water could never be taken for granted. On a modern map, it can look that way. a blue line running through a vast field of yellow and brown. River here, desert there, life on one side, emptiness on the other. But that is not how the landscape worked. The Nile flowed through the desert, yes, but it was also connected to worlds far beyond its banks. Its water came from rainfall falling hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. Rain over the Ethiopian highlands fed the Blue Nile. Rain over the lake regions of eastern and central Africa fed the White Nile. Smaller tributaries, seasonal rivers, groundwater systems, and wetlands all contributed to the larger network. So when people in what is now Egypt watched the river rise, they were seeing the distant rains arrive. They may not have known the geography of those faraway highlands. They could not have traced the river back across mountains and lakes. But they understood the pattern. The flood came. The water spread across the floodplain. Dark silt settled over the fields. Fish moved into shallow channels. Birds gathered in the wetlands. Reeds grew. Grazing improved after the waters withdrew. The Nile was reliable in a way that a Saharan seasonal lake was not. Not perfectly reliable, never perfectly reliable. Some floods were too weak. Others were dangerously high. River channels shifted. Marshes expanded and contracted. Disease, insects, crocodiles, and the sheer force of floodwater made the valley a demanding place to live. But compared with an interior where rain-fed lakes were shrinking and pasture was becoming uncertain, the Nile offered something extraordinary: renewal. Every year the river brought water and fertility into a narrow corridor, and as the Sahara dried, that corridor became more valuable. This is why the Nile Valley was a refuge, but it was also a corridor, and eventually in many places, a bottleneck. A refuge is a place where people can survive when surrounding lands become difficult. A corridor is a route that allows people, goods, ideas, and animals to move from one region to another. The Nile was both. Boats could travel along its current, and against it with sails or towing. People could walk along its banks. Communities could communicate over long distances through chains of settlements. A traveller arriving at one stretch of river was not entering an isolated oasis. They were entering a long connected world, but the green land itself was limited. In much of the valley, steep desert cliffs or dry gravel plains pressed close to the river. Beyond the floodplain lay land that might support temporary camps, quarrying, hunting or travel, but not large populations dependent on regular food production. The usable zone could be only a few miles wide, sometimes less. And that changes everything. On open grassland, families can spread out. Herds can move in different directions. If one lake is crowded, perhaps another lies beyond the horizon. But along a river hemmed in by desert, many people depend on the same strips of cultivable soil, the same fishing grounds, the same landing places, the same reed beds, the same flood cycles. As more people spent more time near permanent water, resources became concentrated. So did opportunity, so did tension. This does not mean the Nile Valley suddenly filled with desperate refugees in one dramatic moment. The evidence does not support a simple story like that. People had lived near the Nile for a very long time. They had their own local traditions, their own ways of fishing, hunting, gathering plants, tending animals, and eventually growing crops. Nor did every person leaving the drying Sahara go to the Nile. But the valley became increasingly connected to the changes unfolding west of it. The western desert was not an impenetrable wall. During wetter periods, seasonal rivers and grasslands had linked the Nile with lakes, basins, and pastoral territories farther west. As the climate became drier, many of those routes grew more difficult. Yet difficult is not the same as closed. People still moved through wadis after rain. They travelled between wells and springs. They followed known paths to oases. They carried stone, shells, animal products, pottery, and knowledge. A route across the desert did not need to support permanent settlement along every mile. It only needed enough dependable stopping points for experienced travellers to cross it. And experienced travellers existed. Pastoral communities in the western desert knew where cattle could find grazing after rare rains. They knew which depressions held water longest. They knew how to organise movement around the needs of animals. Some of those communities had connections with people in the Nile Valley through exchange, marriage, seasonal travel, and shared technologies. Archaeology preserves pieces of this contact. Similar styles of pottery appear across broad regions. Animal remains show the spread and changing importance of herding. Stone tools, ornaments, and raw materials travelled farther than the people who made them. In Egypt, objects made from desert stone or materials originating far from the river remind us that the valley was never sealed off from its surroundings. But archaeology rarely gives us a neat label saying, "This person came from here, and this family moved there." A pot can travel without its maker. An idea can travel without a population. A herding practice can spread because neighbours copy something useful. So the safest conclusion is not that one single Saharan people entered the Nile and created a new society. It is that the Nile was part of a larger North African world, and that world was being reorganised by drying conditions. The river drew people in because it concentrated water, but it also forced new decisions because it concentrated people. Imagine a family arriving from the western margins after generations of wider movement. They know livestock. They know seasonal uncertainty. They know how to read sparse pasture and protect animals through dry months. Along the Nile they encounter communities with intimate knowledge of the floodplain, where fish gather as waters fall, where wild plants grow, where boats can land, which patches of soil remain productive after inundation. Neither group is simply replacing the other. They are meeting in a crowded landscape. They may trade, they may marry, they may compete over grazing near the river. They may exchange tools, stories, rituals, and methods of storing food. Over generations, distinctions that were once clear can blur. A community can become more settled without forgetting its pastoral past. A river people can adopt animals, techniques, and relationships that originated in the desert. This is the deeper meaning of the Nile bottleneck. Aridification did not invent human creativity. It did not automatically produce villages, chiefs, kings, or pyramids. Climate does not command people to build civilization. People make choices within the pressures and possibilities they inherit. But when reliable water becomes scarce across a huge region, the places where water remains dependable become intensely important. More people depend on them. More goods pass through them. More disputes need to be managed. More cooperation becomes possible, and more inequality can emerge. The Nile did not stand apart while the Sahara died. It became one of the places where the Sahara's long transformation was gathered, compressed, and turned into a different kind of human future. And you can see that future beginning to take shape in the villages. Not cities yet, not kingdoms, no pyramids rising over the floodplain. No pharaoh wearing the double crown, no single state called Egypt. Just settlements, clusters of mud brick houses, reed shelters, storage pits, hearths, pottery fragments scattered through dark soil, fish bones, cattle bones, grinding stones worn smooth by hands turning grain into flour. Burials placed near the living because in these early communities the boundary between household, ancestry, work, and ritual was not always sharply divided. By the 5th and 4th millennia BC, communities along the Nile were becoming more settled and more connected. In Upper Egypt, the long southern stretch of valley, archaeologists recognized traditions usually called Badarian and later Nakada. In Lower Egypt, around the broad delta in the north, other communities developed their own local traditions, including those known from sites like Merimda, Mahdi, and Buto. These names can make the past sound tidier than it was. The Badarian culture, for example, is named after a modern region where archaeologists found distinctive graves, pottery, tools, and evidence of farming communities. Nakada is named after another site and is often divided into phases, Nakada I, II, and III, because the material record changes over time. But the people living then did not call themselves Badarians or Nakadans. Those are modern labels, useful for organizing evidence, but not ancient identities. Still, the evidence tells us something important. The Nile Valley was becoming a place of increasingly permanent life. People cultivated crops, especially wheat and barley, in suitable parts of the floodplain. They kept sheep, goats, and cattle. They fished the river and its marshes. They hunted birds and wild animals. They collected plants, worked stone, made pottery, and built boats or boat-like watercraft, capable of moving people and supplies through channels that linked one community to another. This was not a simple switch from hunting to farming. Food came from many sources. A household might plant grain but still depend heavily on fish during one season, grazing animals during another, wild plants when crops failed, and trade when local supplies were short. Farming gave people a powerful new way to store food and plan ahead. But the Nile itself remained central. Its flood shaped the agricultural calendar. Its fish fed people. Its reeds supplied fibre and building materials. Its channels made movement easier than travel across the desert. A village beside the river had advantages, but it also required coordination. Fields had to be planted at the right time. Animals had to be kept from destroying crops. Grain needed protection from insects, damp, theft, and hungry neighbours. Floodwater could renew the soil, but it could also erase boundaries, damage houses, and force people to move. The more settled a community became, the more it had to organise labour, storage, access to land, and relationships with nearby settlements. And this is where the long drying of the Sahara enters the story again. Not as one enormous migration wave, not as a single people arriving from the west and suddenly transforming Egypt. The archaeology is much more complicated than that. But the villages of the Nile did not develop in isolation. They used materials that came from beyond the river corridor. Desert stone was shaped into tools, pallets, vessels, and ornaments. Shells moved from distant coasts. Pigments and minerals came from mountain zones and desert outcrops. In later predynastic periods, goods from the Levant, Nubia, and perhaps farther regions appear in Egyptian sites. The Nile was becoming a route through which distant landscapes could meet, and the deserts around it remained part of that system. Pastoral traditions had deep roots across northeast Africa. Cattle, sheep, and goats were not just food, they were moving stores of wealth. They could provide milk, hides, dung for fuel, meat for feasts, and status for families able to maintain large herds. They also required knowledge. You needed to understand grazing, breeding, watering places, seasonal movement, disease, and the constant calculation of how many animals the land could support. Some of that knowledge had developed among communities living beyond the Nile, in landscapes where mobility was essential. As those landscapes became drier, ties between pastoral people and river communities may have become more important. Maybe families moved toward the valley. Maybe herders visited seasonally, trading animals or animal products for grain, tools, and crafted goods. Maybe marriages linked people who lived by the river with people whose lives still extended into the desert. Maybe practices spread without large movements of people at all, copied because they worked. This is one of archaeology's great frustrations. You find a new kind of pottery, Did migrants bring it? Did local potters imitate an imported vessel? Did traders carry it from village to village? You find cattle bones in a settlement. Does that prove pastoralists arrived, or does it show that local farmers had expanded their herds? You find a stone tool made from a distant material. Did its owner travel across the desert, or did the object pass through 10 pairs of hands? The answer is often, we do not know, but uncertainty does not mean nothing happened. It means the real process was probably more human, more gradual, and more tangled than the old stories of invasion and replacement. People moved in small numbers. Goods moved farther. Skills moved farther still. A marriage could connect 2 communities. A seasonal camp could become a trading place. A drought could make an old route more valuable, then less valuable, then valuable again after rain. Over centuries, these countless small connections changed the character of Nile life. In Upper Egypt, Nakada communities grew larger and more socially differentiated. Some burials contained more elaborate goods than others. Fine ceramics, stone vessels, cosmetic palettes, ivory ornaments and objects made from rare materials. That does not necessarily mean there were kings yet, but it suggests that some people had greater access to labour, trade, ritual prestige, or stored wealth. In Lower Egypt, communities in the delta developed differently, shaped by marshlands, Mediterranean connections, and broad expanses of cultivable ground. Their houses, pottery, foodways, and trade links were not identical to those farther south. Egypt was not one cultural block waiting patiently to become a kingdom. It was a patchwork of regions, each adapting to a particular stretch of river, wetland, desert edge, and trade route. But the patchwork was becoming more tightly stitched together. And once villages depend on grain stores, livestock, river transport, and long-distance exchange, power begins to matter in new ways. Who controls a storage area? Who organizes work? Who receives visitors from another valley? Who settles disputes over fields and animals? Who can call on relatives beyond the horizon? Who can turn a feast into an alliance into obligation, and obligation into authority? Those questions would not remain small for long. In a wide open landscape, people can often solve problems by moving away. A field is exhausted. Find another patch of ground. A grazing area is crowded. Take the cattle farther out. A neighbour becomes difficult. Put a few miles between your camp and theirs. But the Nile Valley was not wide open. It was a long, narrow corridor. On either side stood desert, to the east harsh hills and the Red Sea mountains. To the west the growing expanse of the Sahara. Along much of the river, the useful land was only a thin strip between water and sand. When more people, more animals, and more villages depended on that strip, leaving was no longer always an easy answer. This did not mean that everyone became desperate. The Nile could be extraordinarily productive. A good flood could renew fields with silt. Fish could be plentiful. Marshes offered birds, reeds, and wild plants. Boats could carry heavy loads much more easily than people could carry them on foot. But abundance has its own complications. The more valuable a place becomes, the more people want a claim on it. A bend in the river with reliable farmland, a landing place where boats could stop. A path leading toward a desert quarry. A basin where cattle could graze after the floodwaters withdrew. A patch of high ground safe from seasonal water. These were not abstract resources. They were the difference between a secure year and a hungry one. And as populations concentrated along the river, cooperation became more necessary. A household could tend its own small plot, but no household controlled the flood. No household alone could maintain every canal, protect every grain store, organize every exchange expedition, or settle every conflict with its neighbours. Communities needed people who could coordinate labour, remember obligations, arrange marriages, host visitors, and make decisions when the river did something unexpected. At first, that authority may have been informal, an older person with many relatives. A skilled herder, a successful trader, someone known for generosity at feasts. Someone whose family had lived in the same place for generations. Someone believed to have a special relationship with ancestors, spirits, or the dangerous forces of the natural world. Power did not arrive one morning wearing a crown. It accumulated slowly through favours, debts, gifts, stored grain, cattle, ritual knowledge, and the ability to bring other people together when it mattered. Archaeologists can see hints of this process in the graves. Some predynastic burials were simple, a body placed in a shallow grave, perhaps with a pot, a tool, or a few personal belongings. Others were more elaborate. They contained fine painted pottery, carefully shaped stone vessels, pallets for grinding pigments, beads, ivory objects, and materials that had travelled a long way to reach the Nile Valley. The difference is important, but it needs to be handled carefully. A rich grave does not automatically prove that the person was a king. It may reflect age, family status, ritual role, or the grief and generosity of surviving relatives. Yet when unequal burials become more frequent, and when certain places contain larger tombs, more imported objects, and more evidence of craft production, it becomes harder to avoid the conclusion that some families were gaining unusual influence. They could command labour, they could acquire rare goods. They could make their authority visible, and visible authority has a strange effect. Once people see that one household can host a larger feast, give more gifts, build a bigger tomb, or obtain materials from distant lands, that household becomes easier to imagine as different. Not just wealthier, more important, more connected, perhaps more favoured by the gods or ancestors. This was one of the quiet beginnings of hierarchy. Not hierarchy created by climate alone. Climate did not invent ambition, loyalty, ritual, fear, generosity, or the human desire for status. The drying Sahara did not somehow force Egypt into existence like a machine pressing out a finished object. But environmental pressure changed the setting in which human choices were made. It narrowed some options and made others more valuable. In a crowded river corridor, control of storage mattered more. Access to water mattered more. Knowledge of routes through the desert mattered more. A leader who could secure grain in a poor year, arrange cattle exchanges, or bring in stone for tools and prestige objects had something real to offer, and someone who controlled access to those things could turn usefulness into influence. Long-distance exchange became part of that story. Ivory moved north from regions where elephants still lived in greater numbers, especially farther south along the Nile and into Nubia. Fine stone came from desert quarries and distant uplands. Gold was available in the eastern deserts and Nubian regions, though its early use was limited compared with later ages. Copper entered Egypt through connections with Sinai and the southern Levant. Shells arrived from the Red Sea and Mediterranean. Exotic woods, oils, pigments, and crafted objects passed between communities, separated by deserts, marshes, and hundreds of miles of river. These were not trade networks in the modern sense. There were no commercial companies, no coins, no customs offices. Exchange likely moved through many forms. Direct travel, seasonal meetings, gift-giving, marriage ties, feasts, partnerships between families, and objects passed from one community to the next. A piece of ivory might change hands several times before it reached a workshop in Upper Egypt. A jar made in the Levant might arrive not because its owner had crossed the whole distance, but because it had travelled through a chain of traders and river settlements. A block of rare stone could become valuable precisely because few people knew where to find it, how to extract it, or how to transport it safely. And rare materials did more than decorate the lives of the wealthy. They created specialists. Someone had to quarry the stone. Someone had to shape it. Someone had to drill tiny beads, carve ivory, fire fine pottery, weave cloth, build boats, and prepare pigments. Most people still farmed, fished, herded, and managed households. But in larger settlements, some individuals could spend more time becoming exceptionally good at particular tasks. Craft specialization is easy to underestimate. It sounds ordinary. Just people making things, but it changes society. A specialist depends on food produced by others. A leader who supports specialists gains access to valuable objects. Valuable objects can be exchanged for alliances. Alliances can bring labor, protection, marriage partners, and new sources of wealth. Slowly, a village becomes more than a collection of households. It becomes a place with institutions, obligations, and people whose roles are no longer interchangeable. If you're enjoying this slow journey through the deep past, you can find the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description. It is there whenever you feel like following a few more ancient questions into the night. Now, imagine the river around 3600 BC. Not a unified Egypt, not yet. But some Upper Egyptian centres were growing in reach and prestige. Places associated with Nakada, Abydos, and Hierarchies show evidence of larger communities, elaborate cemeteries, ceremonial activity and connections extending far beyond their immediate fields. Hierarchies, in particular, appears to have been a major centre, with evidence for feasting, craftwork, animal keeping and ritual practices on a scale that suggests organised communities with powerful local leadership. Ritual may have been as important as grain. A ritual centre could gather scattered people at certain times of year. It could turn shared beliefs into shared identity. It could provide a place where disputes were settled, marriages arranged, gifts exchanged, and leaders displayed their generosity. It could also make inequality feel natural, even sacred. If one family provided the feast, sponsored the ceremony, or claimed special access to the ancestors, their authority could become woven into the spiritual life of the community. And then there was competition. When neighbouring centres wanted the same land, the same trade routes, or the same prestige, cooperation could become rivalry. Leaders who had once competed through feasts and gifts might begin competing through armed followers, fortified places, raids, or the capture of valuable territory. The evidence for exactly how this unfolded is incomplete. Archaeology rarely gives us the arguments, promises, betrayals, and negotiations behind the objects. But by the late 4th millennium BC, the pattern is hard to miss. Some centres were expanding, some traditions were spreading. Upper Egyptian styles and political influence were reaching farther north. The narrow green corridor was beginning to be organised by larger powers. And somewhere within that long process of exchange, pressure, ritual and rivalry, the foundations of the Egyptian state were being laid. By around 3300 BC, the balance was beginning to change. For centuries, communities along the Nile had been growing, trading, competing and borrowing from one another. They shared certain ways of making pottery, burying their dead, preparing food and using the river. But they were not one people under one government. Egypt was still a patchwork of local worlds. Then a few of those worlds began to become much larger. In Upper Egypt, centres around Abydos, Nakada and Hierarchies seem to have accumulated unusual power. Their leaders had access to craft specialists, long-distance goods, fertile land, river transport, and perhaps most importantly, followers. They could gather labour for large tombs and ceremonial buildings. They could support retainers. They could send expeditions into the desert and receive goods brought from distant regions. And power, once it reaches a certain scale, has a tendency to seek more power. A local chief can protect a village. A regional ruler can demand goods from several villages. A king can turn those demands into a system. Grain, cattle, cloth, pottery, labour, stone, copper, ivory. Things that once moved through gifts and personal relationships could now be counted, stored, redirected, and claimed. This is where Egypt begins to take a shape we would recognise. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic year. The old story used to say that one ruler, often identified as Menes, simply united Upper and Lower Egypt in a decisive conquest around 3100 BC. There may indeed have been military campaigns, later Egyptian tradition remembered an early founder king, and archaeology shows that political unification happened remarkably quickly. But the reality was probably more complicated. Unification was not one event. It was a process. Some regions may have been conquered. Others may have accepted alliances that gradually became submission. Local elites may have been absorbed into the new order, given roles, gifts, marriages, or titles in exchange for loyalty. A ruler did not need to destroy every rival. Sometimes it was more useful to make them part of the machine. And the machine depended on the Nile. The Nile was not perfectly predictable. Floods varied, some came too low, leaving fields dry. Some were dangerously high, but compared with farming in landscapes dependent on uncertain rainfall, the river offered an extraordinary rhythm. Each year water rose from rains far to the south, in regions many Egyptians would never see. It spread across the floodplain carrying silt. Then it withdrew. Fields could be planted in the moist, renewed soil. Crops grew during the cooler months. Harvest came before the next flood. This cycle did not create Egypt by itself, but it gave rulers something unusually valuable, a recurring schedule. If you know roughly when the water will rise, when fields can be planted, and when grain will be harvested, you can begin organizing labor around a calendar. You can collect produce, you can store it, you can distribute rations to workers. You can send people to dig basins, repair embankments, build boats, quarry stone, or serve in expeditions when farming demands are lower. Administration grows from details like these: a sack of grain stored here, a herd counted there, a work crew assigned to a canal, a shipment of stone expected from the eastern desert, a village responsible for supplying beer, bread, linen, or labour. At first, such obligations could be remembered by people. But as kingdoms grew, memory needed help. That is one reason writing appears when it does. The earliest Egyptian signs and labels emerging near the end of the 4th millennium BC were not poems or philosophy. Many seem connected to goods, places, names, ownership, and administration. A mark on a jar, a tag on a bundle, a sign identifying an estate or ruler. Simple, practical things, but practical records can change the world. Once authority can be recorded, it can travel farther than the person giving the order. A ruler does not need to stand beside every grain store. A named official, a seal, a label, a recognized symbol can carry that ruler's claim into places they have never visited. The river helped make this possible because it was also a road. Moving goods overland is exhausting. A heavy stone vessel, a load of grain, or a bundle of timber becomes a problem the moment people have to carry it for days. But put it on a boat, and the Nile can connect communities from the first cataract in the south toward the delta in the north. The current carries boats northward. Prevailing winds often helped sailboats return south. It was a long, narrow kingdom waiting for a transport system. Yet Egypt was never only the river. The desert on either side could look empty from a distance. but it contained routes, wells, quarries, mines, grazing grounds, and connections to other worlds. The eastern desert led toward the Red Sea, Sinai, and routes into the Levant. From there came copper, oils, timber, and unfamiliar goods. The western desert connected the valley to oases and, farther beyond, to the changing lands of the Sahara. To control Egypt meant more than controlling fields beside the Nile. It meant controlling the places where people entered the valley, the routes used by herders, the tracks leading to gold-bearing regions and stone quarries, the desert margins where mobile groups could trade, raid, work, or seek refuge. It meant knowing where water could be found beyond the cultivated strip and who had the right to use it. This was one reason early kingship was so concerned with boundaries, expeditions, and enemies. On ceremonial objects, rulers appeared defeating rivals, hunting dangerous animals, or bringing distant lands under order. These images were propaganda, not photographs. They do not tell us exactly what happened on a particular battlefield, but they do tell us how rulers wanted to be understood. The king was the person who turned disorder into order, the one who subdued threats, the one who connected the two lands, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the delta, into a single cosmic arrangement. That ideology mattered. A state is not held together by force alone. Soldiers can take grain, but they cannot make every community believe that taking grain is proper. For that, rulers need stories. They need rituals, symbols, ceremonies, sacred places, and a vision in which hierarchy is not merely useful but necessary. Early Egyptian kings increasingly presented themselves in exactly this way. Their names appeared in special frames called seric signs. Their tombs became larger and more elaborate. Their rule was linked to gods, ancestors, fertility, and the continuing life of the land. The yearly flood, the growing crops, the stability of the kingdom, and the authority of the king could all be imagined as parts of one great pattern. So where does the dying Sahara fit into this? It clearly changed the wider human landscape. As grasslands retreated and water became less reliable, communities had fewer options in some regions. The Nile Valley became relatively more important. Knowledge of desert routes, oasis access, cattle, and seasonal movement may have moved with people entering or interacting with the river corridor. But we should be careful. We cannot point to every early Egyptian custom and say, this came from Sahara refugees. We cannot trace a straight line from a drying lake basin to a royal tomb at Abydos. People along the Nile had their own long histories. The Delta, Nubia, the Eastern Desert, Sinai, and the Levant all mattered too. Climate created pressures and opportunities. It did not write the political decisions. Egyptian state formation came from many forces meeting in one narrow place. A productive river, growing populations, trade and craft specialization, competition between regional centers, control of transport routes, new systems of record-keeping, religious authority, ambitious rulers, cooperation, coercion, negotiation, and probably violence. The Sahara's drying did not create the pharaoh like a flood leaving behind a finished statue, but it helped transform the world around the Nile into a place where concentration mattered, where land was valuable, where movement could be controlled, where a ruler who commanded river, desert, grain, labour and belief could become more than a powerful local leader. He could become king of Egypt, and even after Egypt became a kingdom of river towns, floodplains, granaries and royal tombs, the desert did not disappear from Egyptian life. It was always there. To the east, beyond the cultivated fields, rose the broken mountains of the eastern desert. Dry valleys cut through red and black stone. Tracks wound toward the Red Sea. There were no broad fields there, no dependable villages along a river. But there were wells, mineral deposits, grazing places after rare rains, and routes leading outward towards Sinai, Nubia, Arabia, and the Levant. To the west lay a different kind of distance: sand, gravel plains, limestone ridges, and scattered oases. Some of those oases were close enough to the Nile Valley to become regular parts of Egyptian life. Others were gateways into a Sahara that was becoming harsher, but was never simply abandoned. For early Egyptians, then, the desert was not an empty edge around a civilized centre. It was a frontier, a place of danger certainly, a place where water could vanish, where travellers could lose their way, where enemies and raiders might appear from beyond the horizon. But it was also a place of opportunity. Stone came from desert quarries. Copper and turquoise came through routes towards Sinai. Gold came from the eastern mountains and farther south in Nubia. Incense, shells, animal skins, hardwoods, and other rare goods arrived through long chains of exchange. A king who could organize an expedition into the desert was demonstrating more than courage. He was demonstrating reach. He could gather workers, feed them, equip them, guide them to water, protect them, and bring valuable materials back to the Nile. In later Egyptian inscriptions, officials proudly recorded quarrying expeditions and mining journeys. They named the number of men involved, the hardships endured, the wells reached, the stone extracted. These records come much later than the first kings, but they reveal a pattern that likely had deep roots. The state looked outward into the desert because the desert contained things the river valley could not provide. And long before written inscriptions, people had been moving through these landscapes. Across parts of the eastern and western deserts, archaeologists have found rock art, campsites, tools, pottery, and traces of ancient pathways. Some belong to periods when the Sahara was greener than it is today. Others belong to the centuries when rainfall was failing and people were adapting to a changing world. The evidence does not show one single migration, one single people, or one simple story. But it does show continuity of movement. Humans knew these lands. They remembered where water could be found. They travelled between the Nile, the oases, the Red Sea hills, and the grasslands beyond. One of the most striking clues is cattle. Cattle appear again and again in Saharan rock art from the wetter millennia before Egyptian unification. They were painted and engraved in scenes of herding, ceremony, and daily life. In some places, the animals are shown with elaborate horns, decorated bodies, and what may be ritual attention. This was not just food. Cattle were wealth, mobility, milk, status, sacrifice, and a way of organizing life around seasonal pasture and water. Cattle also mattered enormously in early Egypt. They were counted, taxed, offered to the dead, sacrificed in ceremonies, and displayed as signs of royal abundance. Early Egyptian art includes cattle processions and scenes of herding. Later royal ideology even used powerful bovine imagery to express strength, fertility, and dominion. The famous image of the king as a bull was not an accidental metaphor. It belonged to a world in which cattle were deeply meaningful. Does that prove that Egyptian cattle culture came directly from the Green Sahara? Not by itself. Cattle had long been important across northeast Africa. Ideas, animals, and people moved through many regions over thousands of years. The Nile Valley had its own local traditions, and Egypt was connected to Nubia, the Levant, Sinai, and the Mediterranean, as well as to the Western Desert. Similar imagery can emerge because people living with cattle often develop similar concerns: breeding, pasture, prestige, ritual, and survival. Still, it is plausible that memories of a wetter pastoral world persisted in some form. Not necessarily as a story told around a fire. Once the desert was green. Human memory rarely survives unchanged for thousands of years. and we should not imagine early Egyptians carrying a perfect oral record of climate history from 3900 BC. But practical memory can endure differently, in roots, in seasonal habits, in knowledge of wells, in inherited rituals around cattle, in family connections between the Nile and the oases, in the lingering importance of landscapes that had changed, but had not vanished from people's imagination. Egyptian hunting imagery may preserve part of this relationship too. Elite tombs and ceremonial objects often show rulers or nobles hunting wild animals in marshes and deserts. Some of this was symbolic. To hunt dangerous creatures was to show mastery over chaos. Wild bulls, lions, hippopotamuses, and desert animals could stand for forces beyond ordinary control. But hunting was also real. Desert margins held game, and expeditions into those spaces brought people into contact with herders, hunters, miners, and traders. The desert was never fully outside Egyptian order. It supplied labourers and guides. It provided roads around obstacles and passages toward foreign lands. It sheltered communities beyond direct state control. It could produce wealth, danger, and surprise. Egyptian rulers tried to map it, name it, patrol it, and claim it. Yet no king could make it entirely obedient. And perhaps that is why the desert remained so powerful in Egyptian thought. The Nile Valley represented repetition, flood, planting, harvest, renewal. The desert represented distance, uncertainty, death, but also hidden riches and sacred possibility. Tombs were built at the edge of cultivation where green land gave way to dry stone. The dead crossed westward with the setting sun. Mountains, wadis, and empty horizons became part of the geography of the living and the dead. So the Sahara's long drying was not only a prehistory that ended before Pharaohs. Its consequences continued around them, in the cattle they valued, the routes they travelled, the people they encountered, the materials they sought, and the frontier they could never quite turn into an empty border. Beyond Egypt's western deserts, meanwhile, other societies were making their own adaptations to the same changing world. Far beyond Egypt's western frontier, the drying Sahara was creating another world. Not all at once, not with a single line where grass ended and desert began. Climate rarely works that neatly. Rainfall shifted from decade to decade, season to season. One valley might still hold water after the rains. A basin might support pasture for several years, then fail. A route remembered by grandparents as reliable could become dangerous within a single lifetime. But the broad direction was clear. As the interior became drier, the zones where people could live year after year moved southward, and toward the edges of rivers, lakes, highlands, and seasonal grasslands. The Sahara did not simply empty, it changed its rules. And people changed with it. To the south of the growing desert lay the Sahel, a vast belt stretching across Africa from the Atlantic toward the Nile. Today it is often described as the land between the Sahara and the wetter savannas farther south. But that makes it sound like a narrow border, a fixed strip on a map. It was never fixed. The Sahel is a transition zone. Its northern edge can advance or retreat with the rains. Its grasses can flourish after a good wet season and disappear after a sequence of dry years. Rivers rise suddenly, spread across floodplains, then shrink back. Herd animals move, wild animals move, and human communities with all their accumulated knowledge of pasture, wells, and seasonal weather move too. For people living through the drying after 3900 BC, this flexibility was not a detail. It was survival. A settled farming village needs dependable rain, dependable soil, or dependable water. A pastoral community can sometimes respond differently. If one grazing area fails, herders can move cattle, sheep, or goats toward another. That mobility came at a cost. Animals need water. Families need food. Children and older people cannot travel endlessly, and moving into an area already used by other communities could lead to negotiation, alliance, exchange, or conflict. Still, herding offered a powerful way to live in an unpredictable landscape. Cattle were especially important where pasture and water could support them. They could provide milk, meat, hides, dung for fuel, and, perhaps most importantly, a form of stored wealth that could walk. A herd could be divided among families, exchanged in marriage arrangements, offered in ritual, or moved away from a failing landscape. But cattle alone were rarely enough. Many communities probably used mixed strategies. They hunted wild game when it was available. They gathered wild grains, fruits, roots, and seeds. They fished in rivers, lakes, and seasonal wetlands. In places with suitable conditions, they cultivated plants. They kept animals, but they also depended on the labour of gathering, fishing, and small-scale farming. The old division between herders and farmers can be misleading. Real households often did both, adjusting their choices as the weather changed. Imagine the pressure of a drying year. The grasses are shorter than usual. Water holes are crowded. Cattle lose weight. The distance between grazing areas grows. A family that once spent part of the year near an inland lake may now travel farther south toward a seasonal river or a more reliable floodplain. There they meet people who have also arrived because their own land has become less dependable. That is how environmental change becomes social change. More people gathering around fewer reliable water sources means more exchange. Animal products can be traded for grain, fish, stone tools, pottery, or access to land. Information becomes valuable. Which pools still hold water? Which pasture recovered after the last rains? Which route is safe? Who controls the crossing place? The well, the lake shore. But pressure can also sharpen boundaries. A grazing territory that once seemed open may become closely guarded. Communities may form stronger alliances with neighbours and stronger identities against outsiders. Leaders who can organise herds, settle disputes, protect access to water, or distribute food in hard years may gain influence. We cannot see every one of these decisions in the archaeological record. Potsherds, animal bones, grinding stones, campsites, and rock art give us fragments, not conversations. But the pattern is hard to miss. As reliable land contracted, human life became more concentrated around the places where life could still be sustained. This was the beginning of a long Sahelian history. Not the later kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, Kanem, or Songhai. Those states belonged to much later centuries, shaped by ironworking, long-distance trade, Islam, horses, gold, and political developments unimaginable in 3900 BC. We should not project their cities and empires backward into a world of small villages, mobile herders, fishers, and seasonal camps. But the ecological foundations were taking shape, a world organised around uncertain rain, around cattle and grain, around movement between dry grasslands and wetter floodplains, around the difficult art of living where neither desert nor forest fully ruled. The Green Sahara had once offered broad possibilities across its interior. As it dried, those possibilities narrowed, but they did not disappear. They gathered along the margins where people learned that survival depended not on defeating an unstable environment, but on reading it closely enough to move with it. And some of the most important of those margins were not margins at all. They were worlds of water. To the east of the Central Sahara lay the Lake Chad Basin. Today, Lake Chad is relatively shallow and famously variable, expanding and shrinking with the rains, the rivers that feed it, and the demands placed on its water. But during the African Humid Period, this basin held something much larger. At its greatest extent, the ancient lake often called Mega-Chad, spread across an enormous area of what are now Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon. It was not one perfect blue circle on the map. It was a changing system of open water, reed beds, marshes, channels, islands, and seasonal shorelines. A landscape where fish could be caught in vast numbers, where birds gathered, where grazing animals came to drink, and where people could find resources even when the surrounding grasslands became unreliable. As the Sahara dried, this mattered more and more. A lake is never just a lake to the people living beside it. It is food, it is drinking water, it is mud for building, reeds for mats, baskets, roofs, and perhaps boats. It is a route through the landscape, and a meeting place between communities arriving from different directions. The retreat of Mega-Chad did not mean that life around the basin ended. In some ways, the changing shoreline created new possibilities. As water levels shifted, fresh sediments were laid down. Wetlands formed where fish, shellfish, water birds, and edible plants could be gathered. Former lake beds could become grazing land after the waters pulled back. Families who understood the rhythms of flood and retreat could use several environments within a relatively small area. But they had to stay flexible. A camp that stood near the water one generation might be far from the shore in the next. A fishing ground could become a grassland. A channel that carried boats or canoes in one wet season might become a path for herders in another. The landscape was productive, but it was never still. Archaeology around the wider Lake Chad region shows deep histories of pottery making, fishing, hunting, herding, and later cultivation. The exact sequence varied from place to place, and the evidence is uneven. Water, wind, and shifting sands have buried or destroyed many sites. But the broad picture is clear enough. This was not an empty refuge occupied only after the Sahara failed. It was a long-established cultural landscape, one that became even more important as dry conditions spread across the north. Farther west, another water system offered a different kind of opportunity. The Niger River does something strange. Instead of flowing directly toward the sea after entering the interior of West Africa, it bends northeastward into what is now Mali, then spreads into a vast network of channels, lakes, marshes, and floodplains. This is the Niger Inland Delta, one of the great wetland systems of Africa. From above, it can look almost like a river forgetting where it is supposed to go. During the annual flood, water moves across low ground and fills shallow basins. Fish enter newly flooded areas. Grasses rise along the edges. Birds arrive in extraordinary numbers. Then, as the waters recede, they leave behind wet soils that can be used for grazing and, in later periods, for cultivation. For human communities, this was an environment of abundance. But it was an abundance governed by timing. Fish were available in one season, pasture in another, wild grains and other plants ripened according to their own calendars. Travel by water was easier when channels were full. Travel by land became easier when the floods withdrew. A household could not simply settle once and ignore the changing year. It had to know when to fish, when to move animals, when to harvest, when to repair a boat, when to store food for the dry months. This kind of knowledge is rarely written down, but it can be carried for centuries through stories, seasonal rituals, remembered routes, and the practical education of children watching older people work. The later cultural landscapes of West Africa would grow from many such local traditions, not from one sudden migration pouring south out of the dying Sahara, not from one people carrying civilization from a single source. The evidence does not support a story that simple. Some communities probably moved gradually toward more reliable water. Others stayed where they were and altered their way of life. Some mixed with neighboring groups, some maintained herding traditions. Some depended heavily on fishing. Some began cultivating local grains where soils and rainfall allowed. Some did all of these things at once. Across the Western Sahara and Sahel, archaeology reveals a patchwork: settlements on defensible uplands, seasonal camps near wetlands, cattle-keeping communities, fishing communities, villages with grinding stones and storage areas, and long-distance exchange networks moving stone, shells, pottery styles, and ideas. In places such as the Dar-Tichet region of Mauritania, later prehistoric communities built substantial stone settlements and developed ways of managing grain, livestock, and a demanding seasonal climate. Along the Niger and its tributaries, other communities learned to make floodplains productive without ever fully controlling them. These were not yet the famous cities and kingdoms of West African history, but they were part of the deep foundation beneath them. The Niger inland delta would eventually become a crossroads. Much later, towns such as Djenné and the settlements around it would link farming, fishing, herding, craft production, and trade across the Sahel. Yet the basic lesson was already ancient. Water concentrated life. And where life concentrated, so did memory, skill, exchange, and power. The drying Sahara helped make certain places more important than they had been before. Lake shores, river bends, seasonal wetlands, floodplains that looked empty in one month and alive in the next. But it did not direct every community toward the same destination. Africa was too large for that. Its people were too diverse. Its rivers did not all lead to one future. While some communities gathered around Lake Chad and the Niger, others moved toward the Mediterranean coast, across the Sinai and into the lands beyond Africa. The Mediterranean coast offered another direction. To look at a map, the distance can seem small. From the Nile Delta to the southern Levant is only a short stretch of sea and land compared with the vast interior of Africa. Across the water lay the coast of what are now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. To the east lay Sinai, with its copper-bearing rocks and turquoise deposits. Beyond Sinai were the routes of the Red Sea, leading toward Arabia and the Horn of Africa. But proximity is not the same thing as contact. A sea is not an empty road waiting to be used. It has winds, currents, storms, seasonal dangers, and long exposed coastlines with few safe places to land. A desert crossing has wells, passes, and the constant question of how much water a person or animal can carry. People needed boats, guides, trading partners, and reasons to take the risk. Still, by the 4th millennium BC, the evidence suggests that Egypt was becoming more deeply involved in networks extending beyond the Nile Valley. This was not yet the Egypt of enormous stone temples, imperial armies, and written royal histories. It was a landscape of growing towns, competing regional leaders, workshops, cemeteries, river transport, and communities increasingly able to organize labor on a larger scale. And as these communities expanded, they needed things the Nile could not simply provide. Wood was one example. Egypt had reeds, palms, acacias, and other useful trees. But large, straight timbers suitable for major construction and boat building were limited. The forests of the Levant, especially farther north, offered cedar and other valuable woods. We cannot always trace every ancient plank back to its original forest, but later Egyptian demand for Levantine timber is very clear, and the roots of these relationships may reach back into the late prehistoric period. Wine and olive oil were another possibility. The southern Levant had traditions of grape cultivation and pottery vessels, suited to storing and moving liquids. At late predynastic sites in Egypt, archaeologists have found imported ceramics or locally made copies of Levantine forms. Some large jars seem to have arrived carrying goods from across the northeastern Mediterranean. Chemical studies of residues can sometimes identify wine, oils, resins, or other contents. But not every jar preserves such traces, and not every foreign-looking pot was necessarily imported. Styles can travel without people. Containers can be copied. Trade is often harder to see than it first appears. Yet the pattern is difficult to ignore. As Egyptian elites became more powerful during the 4th millennium BC, foreign materials began appearing in places connected with status and display. Exotic stone, fine oils, resins, metals, rare animals, decorated objects. These things were useful, certainly. But they were also political. If a local ruler could acquire goods that ordinary households could not, that ruler could turn distant exchange into visible power. Picture a village leader offering a feast. Most people know the ordinary food, the ordinary pottery, the ordinary tools made from materials found nearby. Then out comes a scented oil in an unfamiliar jar, a piece of wood from a distant forest, a copper object whose raw material came from harsh mountains beyond the Nile. The object is not merely an object anymore. It becomes proof that someone has connections, labour, and influence. That was one of the quiet engines behind early hierarchy. Exchange did not create Egyptian political centralization by itself. Agriculture, population growth, conflict, ritual, control of river transport, and local traditions all mattered. But long-distance goods gave ambitious leaders something especially valuable, a way to make power visible. The Sinai was important in this wider picture. It linked Egypt with the Levant by land and offered mineral resources of its own, especially copper and turquoise. Later, Egyptian inscriptions record organized expeditions into Sinai, but the earliest phases are much harder to reconstruct. We should be cautious about imagining a fully controlled trade corridor in 3900 BC. What probably existed instead was a shifting mixture of local exchange, seasonal movement, small expeditions, and relationships between communities who knew the desert routes. The Red Sea was another frontier. Egypt's eastern deserts were never empty. They contained routes used by pastoralists, hunters, miners, and travellers moving between the Nile and the coast. The clearest evidence for major Egyptian Red Sea expeditions belongs to later periods. But even in the 4th millennium BC, people in the Nile Valley were increasingly aware that the world did not end at the riverbanks. Shells from distant coasts, stones from remote deserts, and materials moving through multiple hands all point toward wider horizons. And then there was the Mediterranean itself. North Africa's long coast connected Egypt westward towards Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and the Maghreb. But the archaeological evidence for regular, direct contact across the entire coast in this period is much thinner than people sometimes assume. A coastline on a map can create an illusion of easy connection. In reality, communities may have been separated by hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, different seasonal patterns and social boundaries we can no longer see. So we should not imagine one giant network with every settlement in constant communication. It was more like a chain of partially connected worlds. The Nile Delta linked to Sinai, Sinai linked to the southern Levant, the Levant linked northward into Syria and Anatolia. Desert tracts connected oasis communities, pastoral groups, mining zones, and river settlements. The Mediterranean linked some coastal communities while leaving others relatively isolated. Goods could move astonishing distances, but often slowly passing from one community to another without any single traveller making the whole journey. The drying of the Sahara may have changed these networks in subtle ways. As interior routes became less reliable, river valleys, coasts, oases, and well-known crossings could become more important. Communities concentrated near dependable water may have had more reason to exchange food, livestock, craft goods, and information. Leaders controlling access to bottlenecks, landing places, river channels, or desert wells may have gained new advantages. But this is not the same as saying that one climate event remade every society around the Mediterranean and Near East. The Levant had its own rainfall patterns, its own villages, its own emerging economies, and its own political changes. Egypt's growing contact with its neighbours was part of a larger transformation, not a simple chain reaction flowing outward from the Sahara. Still, the connections mattered. As the desert hardened behind them, people along the Nile were not turning inward. They were looking outward too, towards Sinai, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and the lands of the Levant. And through those connections, materials moved, ideas moved. People may have moved. Along with them came new opportunities, new dependencies, and new reasons for rulers to compete. But artifacts can only tell part of that story. A jar, a bead, a piece of stone, or a shared design can reveal a connection. What it cannot always reveal is who carried it, why they travelled, or what language they spoke when they arrived. That is where the evidence becomes both more powerful and more frustrating. Because ancient people did not leave us a single map labelled, "We came from here, travelled this route, spoke this language, and settled there because the rains failed." Instead, they left fragments. A cattle bone in a dry valley, a pottery style appearing hundreds of miles from its earlier centre, a skeleton in a cemetery beside the Nile, a rock painting of herders and livestock. A few genetic signals preserved imperfectly in living people or more rarely in ancient remains. Words that may share deep ancestry across languages now spoken far apart. Each kind of evidence answers a different question. Archaeology is often best at showing what people did. It can reveal herding, fishing, hunting, pottery making, burial customs, house construction, trade, and changing diets. It can show that cattle were present in one region at one time, or that a certain style of decorated pottery spread into another. It can reveal that people used the same stone source across long distances. But archaeology cannot always tell us whether an object moved because people migrated, because traders carried it, or because local craftspeople copied and admired a design. A pot is not a person. If a new kind of pottery appears along the Nile after it was common farther west, that may suggest movement from the western desert. It may also suggest exchange, marriage connections, imitation, or a local invention that happens to look similar. Archaeologists look for patterns rather than single objects. Do house styles change too? Do burial practices change? Are there new animals, new foods, new tools, and new sources of stone all appearing together? The more lines of evidence point in the same direction, the stronger the case becomes. Genetics offers another kind of clue. DNA can sometimes reveal that populations shared ancestors, mixed with one another, or experienced long periods of separation. It can show that living communities carry ancestry connected to ancient populations. In the best cases, ancient DNA taken from human remains can provide a direct glimpse of people who lived thousands of years ago. But in North Africa, ancient DNA is especially difficult to recover. Heat, moisture, and time are brutal on genetic material. The Sahara is dry now, but many of the people central to this story lived in periods and places where preservation was poor. A burial may survive while its DNA does not. And even when DNA survives, one individual is not an entire population. A person buried in a special cemetery may not represent everyone living nearby. There is another problem. Genes do not travel in the same way as culture. A community can adopt cattle from its neighbours without receiving many new settlers. People can change language through trade, intermarriage, political power, or prestige without a large genetic replacement. And migrants can enter a region, marry local people, and leave a cultural impact far larger or far smaller than their genetic contribution might suggest. So when genetic studies find connections between populations around the Sahara, the Nile Valley, the Horn of Africa, or the Mediterranean, they are revealing shared history. But shared history is not automatically a migration route with neat arrows. It is more like seeing that several rivers contain water from the same distant rainstorm. You know there was a connection. You do not yet know every channel the water followed. Language is even more difficult. Languages can preserve astonishingly old relationships. Words for cattle, millet, water, goats, or boat building may sometimes hint at the worlds in which early speakers lived. Shared grammar and core vocabulary can reveal that languages descended from a common ancestral language. This has led scholars to ask whether the movements of pastoralists across the Green Sahara helped spread branches of what are now called Afroasiatic or Nilo-Saharan language families. These are important questions. They are also debated questions. Afroasiatic languages are now spoken across a vast region, including North Africa, the Horn of Africa, parts of the Sahel, the Nile Valley, and Southwest Asia. Egyptian was one branch of this family. Berber languages were another. Semitic languages, including Arabic and Hebrew, were another. But identifying the original homeland of the entire family and dating its earliest spread remains uncertain. Nilo-Saharan is even more complicated. Many specialists see meaningful relationships among some of its languages. Others question whether it is one deep family at all, rather than several families grouped together because they are spoken in neighbouring regions. And even if a language family can be traced to a broad area, linking it directly to one ancient culture is dangerous. Languages have no fossils. The people who painted cattle on Saharan rock walls may have spoken languages with no surviving descendants. The first herders along Lake Chad may have changed languages more than once. A word borrowed across a trade network can travel farther than a family ever does. A conquering elite can impose a language while contributing little ancestry. A small community can preserve a language for millennia, while its genetic ancestry becomes mixed with many others. This is why the history of Saharan pastoralism remains so fascinating. Did domesticated cattle spread westward and southward through the movement of herding populations? In some places, probably, did local hunter-fishers adopt livestock and gradually reshape their own way of life. In other places, that also seems likely. Were there many different pastoral traditions moving, mixing and adapting across a changing landscape rather than one single wave of cattle people? That may be closer to reality. The Sahara was enormous. Its lakes, grasslands, mountains, dunes and seasonal rivers created different worlds. A herding community in the Tassili Highlands did not necessarily live like a fishing community near Lake Chad. People in the Western Sahara may have followed different seasonal rhythms from people moving between the Nile and the Eastern Desert. They could exchange ideas without becoming one people. They could share ancestors without sharing a language. They could speak related languages while maintaining very different customs. And then climate science adds one more layer. Pollen records, lake sediments, cave deposits, ancient shorelines and wind-blown dust help reconstruct the changing environment. They show that the African Humid Period was real. They show that rainfall weakened over time. They show lakes shrinking, vegetation retreating, and desert conditions spreading. What they cannot show by themselves is how any particular family responded. Climate records can tell us that a lake was becoming smaller. They cannot tell us whether one village left after a failed harvest, whether another stayed for 2 generations, or whether a third group turned to raiding, trade, migration, or ritual in response. Human decisions happened at the scale of households, kin groups, local rivalries, and remembered places. Climate created pressures. It did not write commands. This is the temptation historians and archaeologists have to resist. We want a clean map. Green Sahara, then drought, then arrows toward the Nile, the Niger, Lake Chad, the Mediterranean, and the Levant. At the end of each arrow, a new civilization rises. It is a satisfying picture. It is also too neat. Some people certainly moved toward reliable water. Some communities probably merged. Some disappeared. Some shifted from herding to farming, from fishing to trade, from seasonal camps to permanent villages. But others may have remained in dry regions longer than we expect, moving between scattered wells and seasonal pastures. Others may have returned when rains briefly improved. The desert did not empty in one dramatic moment, and the people leaving it did not all become Egyptians, Sahelians, or Mediterranean traders in any simple sense. Every new discovery can change the picture. A newly dated cattle burial can push back a pastoral tradition. Ancient DNA from one skeleton can reveal an unexpected connection. Residue inside a pot can show what people were actually carrying. Satellite images can identify old river channels buried beneath sand. A rock shelter once thought isolated can turn out to sit beside a vanished corridor of lakes and grasslands. So the story of the Sahara's drying is not finished. It may never be finished in the way a written royal chronicle is finished. But that is part of what makes it so compelling. The evidence is incomplete because the people were real. They lived complicated lives in a changing world. They made choices we can only partly recover. And when we gather the fragments carefully, without forcing them into a perfect map, one conclusion remains clear. The death of the Green Sahara did not send one people marching in one direction. It rearranged the possibilities of an entire continent. And that brings us back to the largest question. Did the Sahara's death create civilization? The honest answer is no, not by itself. A drying climate did not invent farming. It did not build villages, organize labor, establish trade routes, create kings, or teach people how to write. The Sahara did not wake up one morning, stop raining, and somehow produce Egypt, the Sahelian world, or the societies of the Nile and Levant. But it changed the conditions under which all of those things became possible. For thousands of years, the Green Sahara had offered room. There were lakes, grasslands, seasonal rivers, and wide corridors where people could move with their animals, fish in changing waters, gather plants, hunt game, and meet other communities without living on top of one another. Population was spread across an enormous landscape. As the rains weakened, that room began to disappear. Water became concentrated, productive land became concentrated, and people gradually and unevenly became concentrated too. This mattered because human societies change when more people must live, work, and negotiate in the same limited places. Along the Nile around Lake Chad, beside the Niger near permanent springs, and along the Mediterranean coast, communities encountered one another more often. They traded more often, they competed more often. They married across group boundaries, shared techniques, borrowed customs, argued over land, and built new alliances. A shrinking world can make networks denser, and dense networks can accelerate change. If your family once moved through a landscape of many seasonal pastures, a bad year might mean travelling farther. But if the pastures are gone and the river valley is crowded, the choices become more complicated. You may need access to a canal, a grain store, a fishing ground, a herd route, or a market. You may need agreements with neighbours. You may need leaders capable of settling disputes, organising work, defending territory, or collecting resources for the next failed season. That does not automatically create a state, but it creates pressures that make new forms of organisation useful. In the Nile Valley, this process helped shape a world where settlements grew closer together along a narrow ribbon of fertile ground. Farming, herding, fishing, craft production, exchange, and ritual became increasingly interconnected. Over time, some communities gained more wealth, more followers, and more control over valuable land and trade. Political transformation followed. Eventually, Egyptian kingdoms emerged. But the Nile was not the only outcome. Farther west and south, people adapted differently. Around Lake Chad and the Niger, communities developed their own combinations of fishing, herding, farming, movement, and exchange. In the Sahel, seasonal mobility remained important. The answer to drying was not always permanent settlement. Sometimes it was becoming better at moving. Sometimes it was diversifying food sources. Sometimes it was maintaining far-reaching connections between dry season and wet season lands. Other groups persisted in desert margins longer than outsiders might expect, using wells, highlands, oases, and knowledge of landscapes that appear empty to us now. Some moved toward the Mediterranean. Some entered the Nile Valley. Some likely joined communities already there. Some may have vanished from the archaeological record without vanishing as people, their descendants absorbed into later populations. So climate stress did not produce one response. It produced adaptation, movement, persistence, and in certain places, political centralization. And human choices mattered at every step. A community could share water rather than fight for it. Or fight. It could adopt livestock, plant crops, intensify fishing, exchange goods, marry outsiders, follow a local leader, reject that leader, or leave for another valley. Technologies mattered: pottery for storing food, boats for navigating rivers, tools for harvesting grain, systems for managing herds, and eventually methods for organizing labor on a larger scale. Local landscapes mattered too. The Nile's predictable floodplain was not Lake Chad. The Niger's inland delta was not the rocky shelters of the Central Sahara. The same weakening rains created different worlds because people met different soils, rivers, animals, neighbors, and possibilities. Civilization, then, was not the child of drought alone. It emerged from relationships between people and water, herders and farmers, villages and trade routes, old traditions and new pressures. The Sahara's drying did not create civilization like a single blow striking a spark. It gathered people near the places where sparks were already waiting. And that is why the modern Sahara can be so misleading. Look at it today, and it seems permanent. A vast world of stone plains, dune fields, salt flats, dry wadis and distances so immense that a traveller can cross for days without seeing a river, a tree, or another person. It is easy to imagine that it has always been this way. Easy to think of the desert as a blank space between the Mediterranean coast and the greener lands farther south. But it was not blank. Beneath the sand are the traces of shorelines. Beneath the stone are the remains of hearths, tools, pottery, animal bones, grinding stones and graves. On sheltered rock faces, paintings and carvings still show a different Sahara. Cattle with curved horns, hunters, swimmers, giraffes, elephants, and people living in places that now receive almost no rain. Some of those images are difficult to date precisely. Some are separated from us by thousands of years of weathering, argument, and uncertainty. But taken together with lake sediment, ancient pollen, fossil animals, and archaeological sites, they tell a remarkably consistent story. The desert still holds its green past, not everywhere. Not all at once. The Sahara was always a huge and varied region, with wet highlands, dry basins, changing grasslands, and local refuges. Even during the African Humid Period, rainfall did not turn every dune sea into a garden, but across wide areas, seasonal rains reached far north of their modern limit. Lakes expanded, rivers and wetlands appeared where there are now dry channels. Grass supported herds of wild animals, and later, in some regions, the cattle and sheep of human communities. Then the rain belts shifted, slowly at first, and then in certain places with disruptions that may have felt sudden within a human lifetime. Lakes became smaller, wetlands broke into separate pools. Pastures became less reliable. A journey that had once followed water from one season to the next became harder, then impossible. Around 3900 BC, this long transformation had reached an important threshold in many parts of North Africa. But 3900 BC was not a single day when the Sahara died. It was a date inside a long goodbye. Some regions had been drying for centuries or longer. Others retained water, grass, and communities after that point. People did not simply vanish from the interior. They adjusted. They moved their herds, they returned to familiar places in wetter years. They relied more heavily on wells, oases, river margins, and seasonal routes. And when those adaptations were no longer enough, many joined the growing human worlds around the Nile, the Sahel, the Mediterranean, Lake Chad, and the Niger. The effects travelled downstream, not like a single wave, but through countless decisions. A household looking for pasture, a fishing camp following shrinking water, a family carrying pottery, livestock knowledge, songs, rituals, and memories into a new valley, traders choosing a safer route, villages absorbing newcomers, leaders gaining influence where land and water had become more valuable. Over generations, those decisions helped remake northeastern Africa. The Nile became more than a river. It became a corridor where people, ideas, and resources gathered with unusual intensity. Its floodplain supported communities that would eventually become part of one of the ancient world's most powerful states. Farther west and south, other rivers and lakes became centres of life, sustaining societies whose histories would unfold along different paths. And still, the older Sahara remained present. It survived in movement patterns, in cattle traditions, in rock art, in the memory of routes across country, now too dry to cross easily. It survived in descendants whose ancestors had once lived beside lakes that no longer exist. It survived in the quiet fact that a place can change completely, while the people shaped by that place carry something of it onward. That may be the strangest thing about deep history. The landscape you see is never the only landscape that has been there. Under a dune may lie an old lake bed. Under a dry river channel may lie the record of floods, reeds, fish, and human camps. Under the silence of the desert may lie thousands of years of conversation, footsteps, cattle bells, stone tools struck against stone, fires burning beside water under a sky that gave more rain than it does now. The Sahara did not disappear. It changed, and people changed with it. So as you drift towards sleep, perhaps imagine that enormous desert not as empty but layered. Sand above shorelines, stone above villages, night above the memory of grasslands. A green world gone from sight, but not entirely gone from the earth. If you enjoyed this journey, kindly like, comment, and subscribe. And let us know where you are listening from tonight. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description. For now, rest easy. The desert is quiet, but beneath its silence, the old green world is still waiting.